In the climate-controlled archives of the Smithsonian Institution's Photography Department, Dr. Rebecca Thornton was meticulously cataloguing a recently acquired collection of Victorian-era family photographs when she encountered an image that would haunt her for months to come. The photograph had arrived as part of an estate donation from the descendants of the Ashford family, prominent industrialists from Pennsylvania, who had made their fortune in steel manufacturing during the late 19th century. The collection had been stored in a cedar chest for over a century, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper and accompanied by handwritten notes in faded ink that provided minimal context for the images. Most of the photographs were standard Victorian portraits, formal family gatherings, and ceremonial occasions that documented the lives of a wealthy American family during the Gilded Age. But this particular image, buried near the bottom of the collection, was different from all the others. The photograph appeared to be a formal family dinner scene from 1892, depicting what seemed to be a prosperous American family gathered around an elaborately set dining table. The image quality was exceptional for its age, suggesting it had been taken by a skilled professional photographer using the finest equipment available at the time. The composition was carefully arranged, with each family member positioned to create visual balance and harmony within the frame. The patriarch, Henry Ashford, sat at the head of the table in a dark wool suit with a gold pocket watch chain visible across his vest. His weathered hands were folded on the table before him, and his stern expression conveyed the authority and gravitas expected of a successful businessman. His graying hair was meticulously combed, and his posture was rigidly upright, embodying the Victorian ideal of masculine dignity and control. His wife, Catherine, was positioned to his right, wearing an elegant burgundy silk dress with intricate beadwork that caught the flash of the photographer's equipment. Her hair was arranged in the elaborate style fashionable among upper-class women of the era, with careful ringlets framing her face and an ornate comb securing the arrangement at the back of her head. Her expression was more gentle than her husband's, but there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested underlying tension. Their 3 children were arranged around the table with the careful precision typical of formal portraits from that era. Thomas, the eldest son at 16, sat to his father's left wearing a dark suit similar to Henry's, but cut in a style more appropriate for his age. His face showed the awkward transition from boyhood to manhood, with features that were still soft but beginning to show the angular lines that would define his adult appearance. Elizabeth, their 14-year-old daughter, was positioned across from Thomas, wearing a dress of deep blue velvet with white lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged in a simpler style than her mother's, appropriate for her age, but still formal enough for the occasion. Her hands were folded primly in her lap, and her expression was solemn and attentive. William, the youngest at 12, sat beside his sister, dressed in a sailor suit that was fashionable for boys his age during the 1890s. His blonde hair was neatly parted and combed, and his small hands gripped the edge of the table with the nervous energy typical of children forced to remain still for extended periods. The dining room itself was a testament to the family's wealth and status. Rich mahogany furniture dominated the space, from the massive dining table to the elaborate sideboard that displayed the family's finest china and silverware. The walls were covered in damask wallpaper in deep jewel tones, creating an atmosphere of Victorian opulence that spoke to the family's position in society. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, its cut glass facets creating sparkles of light throughout the room that added depth and dimension to the photograph. The table was set with what appeared to be the finest china, featuring delicate floral patterns in gold and blue that matched the room's color scheme. Sterling silver cutlery flanked each place setting, and crystal glasses of various sizes reflected the photographer's flash like tiny mirrors. Heavy velvet drapes framed tall windows that looked out onto manicured gardens, though the photographer had positioned his equipment so that the natural light from outside supplemented, rather than overwhelmed, his artificial illumination. Persian rugs covered portions of the hardwood floor, their intricate patterns adding another layer of luxury to the scene. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual about the composition or the subjects. The family members maintained the serious expressions typical of formal photographs from the 1890s, when long exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still for extended periods. Their clothing was appropriate for the era and their social standing. their posture formal and dignified in accordance with Victorian standards of propriety. But as Rebecca examined the photograph more closely through her professional magnifying equipment, she noticed something in the background that made her pause. Above the fireplace, which was visible in the far corner of the dining room, there appeared to be a mark on the wall that didn't quite fit with the rest of the room's elegant decor. The fireplace itself was a masterpiece of Victorian craftsmanship, featuring a mantel of carved white marble supported by ornate columns. The hearth was decorated with decorative tiles in deep blue and gold that complemented the room's color scheme, and brass andirons supported what appeared to be a carefully arranged display of logs. Above the mantel hung a large oil painting in a gilt frame, depicting a pastoral landscape that was typical of the artwork favored by wealthy families of the era. But it was the wall space above the painting that caught Rebecca's attention. There, clearly visible against the dark wallpaper, was what appeared to be a mark that seemed completely out of place in such an elegant setting. Rebecca adjusted her equipment to get a better view of this anomaly, increasing the magnification and adjusting the lighting to bring out details that might have been missed in a casual examination. What she saw made her blood run cold. There, clearly visible on the wall above the ornate marble fireplace, was what appeared to be a handprint, not a decorative element or a shadow cast by the photographer's lighting, but an actual handprint pressed against the wallpaper, as if someone had placed their palm against the wall while their hand was covered in some dark substance. The handprint was positioned at a height that would be consistent with an adult reaching up to touch the wall, but there was something unsettling about its placement and appearance. It seemed too dark to be a simple smudge or accidental mark, too perfectly formed to be anything other than intentional. Moreover, the handprint appeared to be fresh, as if it had been made just moments before the photograph was taken, the dark substance still wet enough to create a clear impression. The size of the print suggested it had been made by a child's hand, smaller than an adult's but larger than that of a very young child. The fingers were clearly defined, and the palm showed the kind of detail that could only be created by direct contact with the surface. But most disturbing of all was the substance that had created the print. It appeared dark and viscous, almost black in the photograph, and seemed to have a texture that suggested it was not simply ink or paint. Rebecca spent the next several hours examining every detail of the photograph, looking for any other anomalies or inconsistencies that might explain the mysterious handprint. She used various enhancement techniques to bring out details that might have been obscured by the limitations of 19th century photography, but the more she studied the image, the more convinced she became that the handprint was genuine and had been present at the time the photograph was taken. She counted the family members carefully, examining their positions and poses with meticulous attention to detail. Henry and Catherine Ashford, their eldest son Thomas, their daughter Elizabeth, and their youngest son William. All 5 family members were clearly visible and accounted for in their seats around the dining table, their hands all visible and positioned in ways that made it impossible for any of them to have created the mark on the wall. But the handprint suggested the presence of a 6th person in the room, someone who had been close enough to the wall to leave their mark, but who was not visible in the photograph itself. This created several disturbing possibilities that Rebecca found difficult to dismiss. Had someone been hiding in the room during the photograph? Had they left just before the shutter clicked? Or was there something more sinister at play? The positioning of the handprint was particularly troubling. It was located directly above the fireplace, in a position that would have required someone to reach up deliberately to touch that specific spot on the wall. This suggested intentionality rather than accident, as if whoever had made the print had specifically wanted to mark that location for reasons that were not immediately apparent. Rebecca began researching the Ashford family history, looking for any information that might explain the mysterious handprint. She started with basic genealogical records, tracing the family's lineage and documenting their movements and major life events. What she discovered painted a picture of a family that had experienced more than its share of tragedy, despite their outward appearance of success and prosperity. Henry Ashford had been born in 1847 to a middle-class family in Philadelphia, the son of a small business owner who had struggled to make ends meet during the economic uncertainties of the mid-19th century. Through a combination of ambition, ruthless business practices, and fortunate timing, Henry had built his steel empire during the industrial boom that followed the Civil War, accumulating vast wealth by the time he was 40. But Henry's success had come at a cost. Business records and newspaper articles from the period revealed that he had accumulated numerous enemies among his competitors and workers. There had been several attempts on his life by disgruntled employees who had been injured in his factories or fired for attempting to organize labor unions. The working conditions in Ashford's steel mills were reportedly among the worst in Pennsylvania, with high rates of injury and death among the workforce. The family had received numerous death threats over the years, and Henry had hired private security to protect their mansion and had installed elaborate locks and alarm systems that were advanced for the time period. Catherine rarely left the house without an armed escort, and the children were accompanied by bodyguards whenever they ventured outside the family property. But the most relevant information Rebecca found concerned a tragedy that had befallen the family just 6 months before the dinner photograph was taken. The Ashfords had had a fourth child, a daughter named Mary, who had died at the age of 10 in February 1892. The official cause of death was listed as scarlet fever, but the circumstances surrounding her illness and death had been unusual enough to warrant mention in several local newspapers. According to the most detailed newspaper account, published in the Pittsburgh Herald 3 days after Mary's death, the child had been found dead in her bedroom early one morning by her governess, apparently having passed away during the night. But what made the discovery particularly disturbing was that her body had been found in an unusual position, with her right hand pressed against the wall beside her bed. The governess, a woman named Miss Sarah Hartwell, had reported that when she found Mary's body, the child's hand had left a dark stain on the wallpaper that appeared to have been made with blood. The stain was in the shape of a perfect handprint, with all 5 fingers clearly defined, and the palm showing detailed ridges and lines that matched Mary's hand exactly. The family physician, Dr. Edmund Crawford, had examined the scene and had confirmed that the handprint was indeed made with Mary's blood, though he could offer no explanation for how or why the child had pressed her hand against the wall with enough force to leave such a clear impression. He had attributed the strange positioning to the feverish delirium that often accompanied scarlet fever, suggesting that Mary had been reaching for something in her final moments. But the servants had been less willing to accept such a rational explanation. They reported that in the weeks preceding Mary's death, she had been behaving strangely, often talking to empty spaces as if someone were there and claiming that she could see things that others could not. She had complained of feeling cold even when the house was well heated, and had often been found standing in front of mirrors or windows, staring at her own reflection as if she were looking at someone else. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that the handprints were not static marks but seemed to move and change over time. The Pattersons would find prints in one location in the morning, only to discover them in completely different rooms by evening. The prints also seemed to respond to the family's presence, appearing more frequently when the children were in the house and clustering around areas where the family spent the most time. The Patterson family had endured these supernatural phenomena for only 6 months before abandoning the mansion and relocating to another state. They left behind most of their belongings, claiming that the house was uninhabitable due to the constant supernatural activity. Their departure had been precipitated by an incident in which their youngest daughter, Sarah, who was 8 years old, had begun communicating with what she described as the sad children who lived in the walls. Sarah had started leaving her own handprints throughout the house, pressing her palms against windows and mirrors in apparent imitation of the ghostly children she claimed to see. She had also begun drawing pictures that showed stick figures of children with dark handprints covering their bodies, similar to the drawings that William Ashford had created before his death. When the Patterson parents had tried to stop Sarah from this behavior, she had become violent and had claimed that Mary and her brothers and sister were teaching her how to play their special games. The final straw had come when Sarah had been found one morning with dark handprints covering her nightgown, prints that appeared to have been made by multiple children's hands, and that could not be washed out of the fabric. Over the years, the mansion had changed hands multiple times, but no owner had been able to live there for more than a few months without experiencing the supernatural phenomena. Eventually, the house had been abandoned and had fallen into disrepair before being demolished in the 1920s to make way for a new development. But the demolition of the mansion had not ended the supernatural activity associated with the Ashford family. The handprints had not been confined to their former home, but had begun appearing in other locations, connected to the family's history. The steel mills that Henry had owned had experienced mysterious accidents and equipment failures that workers attributed to the presence of angry spirits. Several employees had reported seeing the figures of children walking through the factories at night, leaving handprints on the machinery and walls. These sightings had been particularly frequent in the areas where workers had been killed or injured during Henry's ownership, leading many to believe that the Ashford children's spirits were seeking vengeance for their father's treatment of his employees. The family cemetery plot, where all 6 Ashfords had eventually been buried together, had become a site of pilgrimage for those interested in supernatural phenomena. Visitors reported seeing handprints appear on the tombstones, particularly on Mary's grave marker, where the prints would materialize and disappear without explanation. The cemetery caretakers had documented hundreds of incidents over the decades, with photographs showing fresh handprints appearing on the monuments, even when no living person had been present. The prints were always accompanied by other supernatural phenomena, including the sound of children's laughter, the appearance of small figures in white clothing, and the sensation of invisible hands touching visitors. Local paranormal investigators had conducted numerous studies of the cemetery, using various forms of equipment to detect and document supernatural activity. Their findings had consistently shown unexplained temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic anomalies, and photographic evidence of translucent figures that appeared to be children, but it was the continued appearance of handprints that provided the most compelling evidence of ongoing supernatural activity. The prints appeared not only on the tombstones, but on the equipment used by investigators, on the windows of vehicles parked in the cemetery, and even on the clothing and skin of people who spent extended periods at the site. Dr. Margaret Ellis, a parapsychologist from the University of Pittsburgh, had conducted an extensive study of the Ashford Cemetery phenomena in 1967. Her research team had documented over 300 instances of handprint manifestations during a 6-month period, using photography, temperature measurements, and electromagnetic field detection to study the occurrences. Dr. Ellis had concluded that the handprints were indeed supernatural in origin, created by some form of residual energy left behind by the deceased Ashford children. Her theory was that the traumatic circumstances of their deaths had imprinted their consciousness onto the physical world in a way that allowed them to continue manifesting physical phenomena even decades after their deaths. The Ashford children's spirits appear to be trapped in a cycle of seeking reunion with their family, Dr. Ellis had written in her final report. The handprints are their way of reaching out across the barrier between life and death, trying to establish physical contact with the world they were forced to leave behind. The phenomena seem to be strongest when families with children are present, suggesting that the spirits are still seeking to connect with living children who remind them of their own interrupted lives. Rebecca realized that the family dinner photograph was more than just a historical document, documenting a supernatural phenomenon that had begun in 1892 and had continued for decades afterward. The handprint above the fireplace was not just a mark on the wall, but the first recorded evidence of Mary's supernatural presence and her attempt to maintain contact with her living family. The photograph had captured a moment of transition, the point at which Mary's spirit had first made itself known to her family during what was intended to be a celebration of their continued prosperity and unity. But instead of documenting a happy family gathering, the image had preserved evidence of the supernatural forces that would ultimately destroy the entire Ashford lineage. But there were additional aspects of the photograph that Rebecca began to notice as she continued her analysis, using increasingly sophisticated enhancement techniques. The lighting in the room seemed uneven in ways that couldn't be explained by the photographer's equipment or the natural illumination from the windows. There were areas of shadow that seemed too dark and too precisely defined, as if they were being cast by objects or figures that weren't visible in the main composition. The crystal glasses on the dining table showed reflections that didn't entirely match the positions of the family members seated around it. In several of the glasses, Rebecca could detect what appeared to be the reflection of a small figure standing near the table, positioned between Catherine and Elizabeth, but clearly not visible in the main image. Using digital enhancement software that had not been available to previous researchers, Rebecca was able to isolate and clarify these reflections. What she discovered confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of the family gathering documented in the photograph. The reflection showed a young girl, approximately 10 years old, wearing a white nightgown and standing with her arms at her sides in a posture that suggested both sadness and resignation. The girl's face was clearly visible in the enhanced reflection, and it matched contemporary photographs of Mary Ashford that Rebecca had found in the family's records. Most significantly, the girl in the reflection was looking not at the camera or at her family, but directly upward, toward the area above the fireplace where the mysterious handprint was located. Her right arm was raised, and her hand appeared to be positioned as if she were in the process of reaching up to touch the wall. This suggested that Mary had not just been present in the room during the photograph, but had actually been in the process of creating the handprint when the image was captured. The camera had somehow failed to record her physical form directly, but the reflective surfaces in the room had preserved evidence of her presence and her actions. Rebecca began to understand that the family dinner had been arranged specifically to include Mary's spirit, that the parents had set a place at the table for their deceased daughter and had attempted to document their reunion through photography. The formal nature of the occasion, the insistence on using the family's own dining room, and the obvious tension visible in the family members' expressions all made sense when viewed in this context. The photographer, Marcus Whitfield, had been hired not just to create a family portrait, but to attempt what Victorian spiritualists called posthumous photography, the practice of trying to capture images of deceased family members who were believed to be present but invisible to the naked eye. This explained the unusual lighting conditions, the extended exposure time, and Whitfield's detailed notes about the supernatural phenomena he had observed during the session. But the handprint above the fireplace represented something more significant than simple spirit photography. It was physical evidence that Mary's consciousness had retained the ability to affect the material world, to leave tangible proof of her continued existence that would survive long after the photographic session had ended. The fact that the handprint had been positioned directly above the fireplace, the traditional heart of a Victorian family home, suggested that Mary was asserting her claim to remain part of the family despite her death. The print was both a greeting and a declaration, announcing her presence while simultaneously marking her territory within the family's domestic space. Rebecca's research into Victorian spiritualism revealed that handprints were considered among the most significant forms of spirit manifestation, representing direct physical contact between the world of the dead and the realm of the living. Unlike other supernatural phenomena that could be dismissed as products of imagination or environmental factors, handprints provided concrete evidence that spirits retained the ability to manipulate physical matter. The dark substance that had created Mary's handprint was particularly significant in this context. Victorian mediums and spiritualists had documented numerous cases of spirits using what they called psychic residue to create visible manifestations. This substance was believed to be a form of materialized spiritual energy that could be molded and shaped by the consciousness of the deceased. The fact that Mary's handprint had been created with this mysterious substance suggested that her spirit possessed unusual power and determination. Most ghost sightings involved passive phenomena, like sounds, temperature changes, or translucent figures, but the ability to create lasting physical marks indicated a spirit with extraordinary strength and purpose. This understanding helped explain why Mary's supernatural influence had proven so destructive to her surviving family members. She was not simply a restless spirit seeking peace, but an active force capable of affecting the physical world in ways that could prove harmful or even fatal to the living. The pattern of deaths that had followed the family photograph supported this interpretation. Each of Mary's siblings had died while leaving handprints beside their beds, suggesting that Mary's spirit had been physically present during their final moments and had somehow been responsible for their deaths. The medical examinations had found no natural causes for these deaths, leading to the conclusion that Mary's supernatural influence had been strong enough to stop her siblings' hearts or otherwise terminate their lives. The handprints they had left behind were not just evidence of their final moments, but proof that Mary had been touching them when they died. Rebecca began to understand that the family dinner photograph had documented not just a supernatural visitation, but the beginning of a supernatural campaign by Mary's spirit to reunite her family in death. The handprint above the fireplace had been her declaration of war against the separation that death had imposed on her family relationships. The subsequent handprints that had appeared throughout the Ashford mansion had been Mary's way of marking her progress as she systematically claimed each member of her family. The prints had grown more numerous and more persistent as her power increased, eventually covering entire rooms and appearing on surfaces throughout the house. The fact that other families who had lived in the mansion had also experienced supernatural phenomena suggested that Mary's influence was not limited to her own relatives. She seemed to be drawn to any family with children, particularly those who reminded her of her own interrupted childhood and her desire to maintain family connections beyond death. Rebecca realized that her own intensive study of the Ashford family photograph had put her in a similar position to the researchers and family members who had previously become targets of Mary's supernatural attention. The handprints that had begun appearing in her apartment were Mary's way of announcing her interest in Rebecca as a potential new subject for her obsessive need to maintain family connections. But Rebecca had several advantages that the Ashford family had lacked. She understood the historical pattern of Mary's supernatural behavior, recognized the warning signs of spirit attachment, and had access to modern psychological and paranormal research that provided context for understanding the phenomena. More importantly, Rebecca was not a family member or someone with an emotional connection to Mary's story that might make her vulnerable to the spirit's manipulative influence. Her interest in the photograph was purely professional and academic, which gave her a degree of emotional distance that could serve as protection against Mary's attempts to establish a supernatural bond. Rebecca made the difficult decision to end her research into the Ashford family photograph and to have it sealed away in the Smithsonian's most secure storage facility. She documented her findings thoroughly, creating a detailed report that would serve as a warning to future researchers about the supernatural dangers associated with the image. Her recommendations were clear and unambiguous. The photograph should not be displayed publicly, should not be examined without proper protective protocols, and should not be studied by researchers who might be vulnerable to supernatural influence due to personal circumstances or emotional connections to the subject matter. The 1892 Ashford family dinner photograph represents a unique historical document that provides compelling evidence of supernatural phenomena, Rebecca wrote in her final report. However, the image also appears to serve as a conduit for ongoing paranormal activity that has proven dangerous to those who study it intensively. The handprint visible above the fireplace is not merely a historical curiosity, but an active supernatural manifestation that continues to affect the physical world more than a century after it was created. Based on the documented history of tragic events associated with this photograph and similar incidents that have occurred among researchers and families who have encountered it, I strongly recommend that access to this image be strictly limited and that any future study be conducted only under carefully controlled conditions, with appropriate safeguards in place. Rebecca's report included detailed documentation of all the supernatural phenomena she had experienced during her research, from the equipment malfunctions in her laboratory to the handprints that had appeared in her apartment. She also provided extensive historical context, tracing the pattern of deaths and supernatural incidents associated with the photograph from 1892 through the present day. The decision to seal away the photograph had immediate effects on Rebecca's personal situation. The supernatural phenomena that had been escalating during her research began to subside within days of her decision to end the project. The handprints stopped appearing in her apartment, the temperature fluctuations in her office ceased, and the sense of being watched that had plagued her for weeks gradually disappeared. But Rebecca knew that the photograph would continue to exist in its sealed storage, its supernatural properties undiminished by the passage of time or the lack of human attention. The handprint above the fireplace would remain as evidence of Mary Ashford's presence at that final family gathering, but it would also continue to serve as a gateway for her spirit's ongoing influence on the physical world. The Ashford family's tragedy had been complete by 1895, but Mary's spirit had continued to search for new subjects for her supernatural attention, new families to claim and destroy in her endless quest to avoid the loneliness of death. The photograph had become her primary tool for attracting potential victims, a trap for anyone who showed too much interest in her story or who might be vulnerable to her manipulative influence. Rebecca's experience had confirmed that the dangers associated with the photograph were real and ongoing, not simply historical curiosities that could be safely studied and dismissed. The handprint above the fireplace was not just evidence of past supernatural activity, but a continuing threat that required careful management and containment. Future researchers who might be tempted to study the image would need to understand that they were dealing with more than just a historical document. They would be entering into contact with a supernatural force that had been claiming victims for more than a century, a spirit whose power had been preserved and even enhanced by the photographic process that had first captured her presence. The 1892 family dinner photograph seemed normal at first glance, documenting a prosperous American family at the height of the Victorian era. But the handprint above the fireplace revealed the presence of something far more sinister, a supernatural force that had destroyed an entire family and continued to hunt for new victims more than a century later. Rebecca's research had confirmed that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some photographs are too dangerous to study too closely. The image would remain in its sealed storage, its secrets intact, its dangers undiminished by the passage of time. And somewhere in the darkness beyond death, Mary Ashford's spirit would continue to wait, ready to claim anyone who dared to look too closely at the evidence of her presence at that final family gathering. The handprint above the fireplace would remain forever, a dark mark that bridged the gap between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, waiting patiently for the next researcher who would be foolish enough to become obsessed with its mysteries. The photograph had served its purpose as both historical document and supernatural trap, preserving not just the memory of the Ashford family's last dinner together, but also the deadly presence that had been invited to join them at their table. In the end, the most disturbing aspect of the photograph was not what it showed, but what it continued to do. The handprint above the fireplace was more than just evidence of Mary's presence during that long-ago family gathering. It was a permanent doorway between the worlds of the living and the dead, a supernatural portal that Mary's spirit could use to reach across the centuries and claim new victims for her ghostly collection. Rebecca had escaped that fate, but she knew that others would not be so fortunate. The photograph would continue to exist, its power intact, waiting for the next person who would be drawn to study its mysteries too closely. And when that person appeared, Mary Ashford would be ready to add them to her collection of souls, just as she had done with her own family more than a century ago. Mary had begun leaving handprints throughout the house, pressing her palms against windows, mirrors and walls in what seemed to be a compulsive behavior. The servants had complained about having to constantly clean these marks, which appeared to be made with some sort of dark substance that was difficult to remove. The handprints had continued to appear even after Mary's death. In the days following her funeral, servants had found fresh prints on various surfaces throughout the house, always the same size and shape as Mary's hands, but now appearing without any visible explanation. The prints would appear overnight, sometimes in rooms that had been locked and secured, suggesting that whatever was creating them could move through the house without being constrained by physical barriers. Several servants had quit their positions with the Ashford family, citing their inability to work in a house that they believed was haunted by the spirit of the dead child. Those who remained were reportedly nervous and jumpy, constantly looking over their shoulders and refusing to work alone in any part of the house. The cook, Mrs. Margaret O'Brien, had been particularly disturbed by the phenomena. She had reported hearing Mary's voice calling for her mother throughout the house, and had claimed to see the child's figure moving through the hallways at night. Most frightening of all, Mrs. O'Brien had found handprints on the kitchen walls that appeared to have been made with what looked like soot or ash, creating dark smudges that seemed to appear and disappear without explanation. Rebecca realized that the handprint in the family dinner photograph might be connected to these supernatural occurrences. Had Mary's spirit been present during the formal family meal, reaching out to touch the wall as she had done in life? Was this photograph documenting not just a family dinner, but a ghostly visitation that had been captured inadvertently by the photographer's equipment? But there were other details in the photograph that Rebecca began to notice as she continued her examination. The expressions on the family members' faces, while appropriate for a formal photograph, seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension and unease that went beyond the normal discomfort of posing for a lengthy exposure. Henry's jaw was clenched tightly, as if he were grinding his teeth or struggling to maintain his composure. His eyes, while focused on the camera, seemed to dart occasionally to the side, as if he were distracted by something happening outside the frame of the photograph. His hands, folded on the table before him, showed white knuckles that suggested he was gripping them together with considerable force. Catherine's expression was perhaps the most telling. While she maintained the gentle smile appropriate for a formal portrait, her eyes seemed to be looking not at the camera, but at something beyond it, something that had captured her attention and concern. Her posture was rigid with tension, and her hands, though properly positioned in her lap, showed signs of trembling that were visible even in the static image. The children's expressions were perhaps the most revealing of all. Thomas, the eldest, appeared to be glancing toward the fireplace area where the handprint was visible, his eyes wide with what looked like fear or recognition. His mouth was set in a tight line, and his entire posture suggested that he was struggling to remain still and composed, despite being deeply disturbed by something in the room. Elizabeth kept her gaze fixed firmly on the table in front of her, as if she were deliberately avoiding looking at something in the room that she found too frightening to confront directly. Her hands were clenched in her lap, and her face showed a pallor that seemed unnatural, even accounting for the lighting conditions of the photograph. Young William seemed to be trembling slightly, his small hands gripping the edge of the table with enough force to whiten his knuckles. His eyes were wide with what appeared to be terror, and his mouth was slightly open as if he were struggling to breathe normally. Unlike his siblings, he seemed unable to avoid looking at whatever was disturbing the family, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere behind the photographer. These subtle signs of distress suggested that the family was aware of something unusual happening during the photograph, something that had put them all on edge, but that they were trying to hide from the photographer. Perhaps they had seen the handprint appear on the wall, or perhaps they had sensed the presence of their deceased daughter in some other way. The formal nature of the occasion seemed at odds with the family's obvious discomfort. This appeared to be a special dinner, possibly celebrating an anniversary or holiday, given the elaborate table setting and the family's finest clothing. Yet none of them seemed to be enjoying the occasion, and all appeared to be struggling to maintain their composure in the face of some disturbing presence. Rebecca decided to research the photographer who had taken the image, hoping to find additional information about the circumstances of the session. The photographer's mark on the back of the print identified him as Marcus Whitfield, a professional photographer who had operated a studio in Pittsburgh during the 1890s and had specialized in portraits of wealthy families. Whitfield's business records, preserved in the Pittsburgh Historical Society, provided a wealth of information about his clients and his photographic techniques. He had been known for his technical skill and his ability to create dramatic lighting effects that enhanced his portraits, but he had also developed a reputation for discretion and professionalism that had made him popular among Pittsburgh's social elite. The entry for the Ashford family dinner photograph, dated August 15, 1892, contained information that chilled Rebecca to the bone and provided crucial context for understanding what had occurred during the photographic session. "Most unusual session with the Ashford family," Whitfield had written in his careful handwriting. "Family appeared extremely nervous throughout the sitting, particularly Mrs. Ashford, who seemed to be watching something that I could not see. Mr. Ashford insisted that I work quickly and use only natural lighting, claiming that the flash powder made his wife uncomfortable, though I suspect there were other reasons for his urgency." The notes continued with increasingly detailed observations that revealed Whitfield's growing unease during the session. "Mrs. Ashford insisted on moving the session to the dining room rather than my studio, claiming that the family needed to be photographed in their own home for sentimental reasons. When I suggested that my studio would provide better lighting and more controlled conditions, she became quite agitated and refused to consider any other location. During the preparation for the photograph, I observed the children glancing repeatedly toward the fireplace area, though I could see nothing there that would attract their attention. The youngest boy, William, appeared to be on the verge of tears throughout the session and had to be repeatedly reminded to look at the camera rather than at whatever was distracting him. Most disturbing of all was the moment just before I opened the shutter. I distinctly heard what sounded like a child's voice calling Mama from somewhere in the room, though all three children were seated at the table and none of them had spoken. Mrs. Ashford's face went white, and she gripped the edge of the table so tightly that I feared she might faint. During the actual exposure, which lasted nearly 30 seconds due to the natural lighting, I observed what appeared to be movement in the background near the fireplace, though I could not identify the source. It looked almost as if someone were reaching up to touch the wall, but there was no one in that area of the room. The family members seemed to be aware of this movement, as they all appeared to be struggling to maintain their poses while obviously being distracted by something I could not see. When I developed the plate several days later, I discovered the unusual mark above the fireplace that appears to be some sort of handprint. I initially assumed it was a flaw in the photographic process, or perhaps a stain on the wall that had been enhanced by the lighting, but upon closer examination, it appears to be a genuine impression made by a human hand. I chose not to contact the Ashford family about this anomaly, as they had already paid for the session and had seemed eager to conclude our business as quickly as possible. I got the distinct impression that they were not surprised by whatever had occurred during the photograph, as if such incidents were commonplace in their household. This account confirmed that something highly unusual had occurred during the photograph session, something that had been noticed by both the photographer and all the family members present. The fact that Catherine Ashford had insisted on having the photograph taken in their home rather than in a professional studio suggested that the family had been reluctant to leave their house, possibly due to their belief that Mary's spirit was confined to the family home and that they needed to include her presence in the formal portrait. The description of the child's voice calling for her mother during the session provided additional evidence that Mary's spirit had been present and active during the photograph. The family's obvious distress and their apparent familiarity with such supernatural phenomena suggested that ghostly visitations had become a regular occurrence in the Ashford household following Mary's death. Rebecca continued her research into the Ashford family's fate following the dinner photograph, hoping to understand how the supernatural phenomena had affected their lives in the months and years after the session. What she discovered added another layer of tragedy to their already troubled story and revealed a pattern of deaths that seemed to be directly connected to Mary's ghostly presence. The first indication that the family's troubles were far from over came in the form of newspaper reports from the months immediately following the dinner photograph. Several Pittsburgh newspapers had reported strange incidents at the Ashford mansion, including unexplained sounds, mysterious lights appearing in windows at night, and servants reporting encounters with what they described as a ghostly child. The Pittsburgh Post had published a particularly detailed account in November 1892, just 3 months after the family photograph had been taken. The article described an incident in which several neighbors had reported seeing a small figure moving through the Ashford mansion's windows late at night, apparently walking from room to room as if searching for something. The figure had been described as that of a young girl wearing a white nightgown and had been seen pressing her hands against the windows from the inside, leaving what appeared to be dark handprints on the glass. The prints had been clearly visible from the street and had remained on the windows for several days before mysteriously disappearing. Local police had investigated the reports and had interviewed the family, but Henry Ashford had dismissed the incidents as the products of overactive imaginations and had refused to allow officers to search the house. However, several servants had spoken to reporters anonymously and had confirmed that supernatural phenomena were occurring regularly within the mansion. The servants' accounts painted a picture of a household under siege from supernatural forces. They described finding handprints throughout the house each morning, always in the same size and always made with some sort of dark substance that resisted normal cleaning methods. The prints would appear on walls, windows, mirrors, and even on personal belongings, as if Mary's spirit were trying to mark her territory and assert her continued presence in the family home. More disturbing were reports of the family members' deteriorating mental and physical health. Catherine had reportedly lost a significant amount of weight and had developed a nervous condition that left her unable to sleep through the night. She had been heard talking to empty rooms as if someone were there, and had been seen setting places at the dining table for Mary during family meals. The children had also begun showing signs of extreme stress. Thomas had developed a stutter that made it difficult for him to communicate clearly, and had begun showing signs of premature aging that concerned the family physician. Elizabeth had become withdrawn and refused to sleep alone, insisting that someone was watching her from the corners of her room at night. William, the youngest, had perhaps been affected most severely. He had stopped speaking altogether for weeks at a time, and when he did talk, it was often to mention conversations he claimed to be having with Mary. He had also begun drawing disturbing pictures that showed stick figures of children with dark handprints covering their bodies. The family's social isolation had increased as word of the supernatural phenomena spread throughout Pittsburgh's upper-class community. Former friends had stopped visiting the Ashford mansion, and invitations to social events had gradually ceased arriving. Henry's business associates had begun to distance themselves from him, apparently concerned that association with the haunted family might damage their own reputations. But the most tragic developments were yet to come. In March 1893, exactly 1 year after Mary's death, young William had died suddenly in his sleep. Like his sister before him, he was found by his governess early in the morning, apparently having passed away during the night. The circumstances of William's death were eerily similar to those surrounding Mary's passing. He had been found with his right hand pressed against the wall beside his bed, leaving a dark handprint that matched the size and shape of his own hand exactly. The family physician, Dr. Crawford, had been unable to determine a cause of death, as the child had appeared healthy the evening before and had shown no signs of illness. The autopsy, performed by Dr. James Morrison at Pittsburgh General Hospital, had revealed no evidence of disease or injury that could explain William's sudden death. His heart had simply stopped beating during the night, a phenomenon that Dr. Morrison had never encountered in a child so young and apparently healthy. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery made by the servants when they prepared William's room for cleaning after his death. In addition to the handprint he had left beside his bed, they found dozens of other handprints throughout the room, all made with the same dark substance and all appearing to be the size of a child's hand. The prints covered the walls, the windows, and even the ceiling, creating a pattern that seemed to tell a story of struggle or desperation. Some of the prints appeared to have been made by William's hands, but others were smaller and seemed to match the size of Mary's hands based on impressions she had left before her death. The implication was horrifying. Mary's spirit had been present in the room during William's final hours, and the two children had apparently been engaged in some sort of supernatural interaction that had ultimately proven fatal to William. The remaining family members were devastated by William's death, but they were also terrified by the obvious supernatural circumstances surrounding it. Catherine suffered a complete nervous breakdown and had to be hospitalized for several weeks, during which time she raved about Mary and William visiting her in her hospital room. Henry, meanwhile, had become obsessed with understanding what was happening to his family. He had consulted with spiritualists, mediums, and religious leaders, seeking some way to communicate with or appease Mary's spirit. Several seances had been held in the Ashford mansion, but these had only seemed to increase the supernatural activity rather than resolving it. During one particularly disturbing seance conducted by a medium named Madame Zelda Kowalski in April 1893, Mary's spirit had reportedly communicated directly with the family. According to witness accounts, Mary had expressed her loneliness and her desire to have her siblings join her in death, claiming that she was unable to rest peacefully while separated from them. The medium had warned the family that Mary's spirit was growing stronger and more determined, and that the remaining children were in grave danger. She had recommended that the family leave their mansion immediately and relocate to a place where Mary's spirit could not follow them, but Henry had refused to abandon his business interests and his established life in Pittsburgh. This decision would prove to be fatal for the rest of his family. In October 1894, exactly 18 months after William's death, Elizabeth had died under virtually identical circumstances. She had gone to bed apparently healthy, but was found dead the next morning, her hand pressed against the wall beside her bed, leaving another dark handprint that the servants were unable to remove. Dr. Crawford, who had now witnessed 3 unexplained deaths in the Ashford family, had begun to suspect that something beyond medical science was responsible for these tragedies. He had documented the similarities between the deaths in detail, noting that each child had died suddenly during the night with no apparent cause, and that each had left a mysterious handprint beside their bed. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, but the medical science of the time could offer no explanation for these strange deaths. Dr. Crawford had consulted with colleagues in New York and Philadelphia, but none had encountered similar cases or could suggest any natural cause for the phenomena. By this time, the local community was beginning to whisper about a curse on the Ashford family. Some blamed Henry's ruthless business practices and suggested that the deaths were divine retribution for his treatment of his workers. Others believed that Mary's spirit had returned to claim her siblings, unable to rest peacefully while separated from them. The supernatural activity in the Ashford mansion had intensified following Elizabeth's death. Servants reported seeing the figures of two children moving through the house at night, both wearing white nightgowns and both leaving handprints on every surface they touched. The prints now appeared in two different sizes, one matching Mary's hands and the other matching William's, suggesting that both spirits were now active within the house. Thomas, now the only surviving child, had become increasingly terrified and had begged his parents to leave Pittsburgh. He had stopped attending school and rarely left his bedroom, claiming that he could hear Mary and William calling his name throughout the house. He had also begun leaving his own handprints on surfaces around his room, as if he were unconsciously mimicking the behavior of his deceased siblings. The family's isolation had become complete by this time. No servants were willing to work in the mansion for more than a few days, and even the family's closest friends had stopped maintaining contact. Henry's business had begun to suffer, as associates became reluctant to meet with him, and several important contracts had been cancelled due to superstitious fears about dealing with the cursed family. Catherine, meanwhile, had never fully recovered from her nervous breakdown following William's death. She had become convinced that she could communicate with her dead children and spent most of her time talking to empty rooms as if Mary and William were present. She had also begun setting places at the dining table for all of her children, including Mary, and would often be found having conversations with invisible companions during meals. The final tragedy occurred in January 1895, when Thomas, the last surviving child, died under the same mysterious circumstances that had claimed his siblings. He was found dead in his bed on the morning of January 23rd, his 18th birthday, with his hand pressed against the wall in the same position as Mary, William, and Elizabeth. But Thomas's death scene was different from those of his siblings in several important ways. Instead of a single handprint beside his bed, the servants found dozens of prints covering the walls, ceiling, and floor of his room. The prints appeared to have been made by multiple children, with different sizes suggesting the hands of Mary, William, and Elizabeth, all apparently present during Thomas's final hours. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of a message written on the wall above Thomas's bed, apparently spelled out using the same dark substance that had created the handprints. The message read, "Come play with us, Tommy. We're waiting for you. Dr. E." Crawford, who had now presided over 4 unexplained deaths in the same family, refused to examine Thomas's body and recommended that the authorities conduct a full investigation into the supernatural circumstances surrounding the Ashford family tragedies. However, Henry's wealth and influence had protected him from serious scrutiny, and the official cause of Thomas's death was listed as heart failure, just as it had been for his siblings. The surviving parents, Henry and Catherine, had become completely isolated following the deaths of all their children. They had dismissed the few remaining servants and rarely left their mansion, apparently believing that their home was the center of supernatural activity that they could neither understand nor control. Catherine's mental state had deteriorated to the point where she was no longer able to distinguish between reality and her delusions about her children's continued presence. She continued to set places at the dining table for Mary, William, Elizabeth, and Thomas, and would often be heard having animated conversations with people who weren't there. Henry, meanwhile, had become obsessed with documenting the supernatural phenomena that continued to plague their house. He had begun keeping a detailed journal of the handprints that appeared each night, the voices that could be heard calling throughout the mansion, and the glimpses of childish figures that he and Catherine saw moving through the rooms. His journal entries, discovered after his death and later donated to the Pittsburgh Historical Society, provided a chilling account of a house under siege from supernatural forces. The handprints continued to appear nightly, now in dozens of locations throughout the mansion, and they seemed to be growing darker and more persistent with each passing day. "The children are becoming bolder," Henry had written in one entry. "Last night I saw all 4 of them standing at the foot of our bed, holding hands and staring at Catherine and myself. Mary was in the center, and she was smiling in a way that filled me with dread. They remained there for several minutes before fading away, but their handprints were everywhere when I woke this morning. Another entry described an incident in which Henry had encountered Mary's spirit directly. I was working in my study when I heard Mary's voice calling for me from the hallway. When I opened the door, she was standing there in her white nightgown, looking exactly as she had before her death, but with eyes that seemed older and sadder. She reached out to touch my face, and I could feel the cold emanating from her hand. "Papa," she said, "why won't you come with us? We're so lonely without you and Mama." The journal documented Henry's growing understanding that his children's spirits were not at rest, and that they were actively trying to bring their parents into death to reunite the family. Mary, as the first to die, seemed to have become the leader of the group, guiding her siblings in their supernatural efforts to claim their parents. In June 1895, Catherine was found dead in the dining room where the family photograph had been taken 3 years earlier. She was discovered seated in the same chair she had occupied in the photograph, but her body was positioned as if she were having dinner with invisible companions. The table was set for 6 people, with places for herself, Henry, and all 4 children, and Catherine's hand was pressed against the table in front of her, leaving a final handprint that matched those found throughout the house. Unlike her children, Catherine showed no signs of struggle or distress. Her face was peaceful, almost relieved, and witnesses reported that she appeared to be smiling slightly, as if she had finally found the peace that had eluded her since Mary's death. The family physician determined that she had died of heart failure, but her body showed no signs of disease or distress that would explain her sudden death. Henry, now the sole survivor of his family, had lived only a few months longer. His journal entries from this period showed a man who had completely given up hope and was simply waiting for his children's spirits to claim him as they had claimed their mother. "Catherine is with them now," he had written in his final entry, dated September 10, 1895. "I can hear her voice joining theirs when they call to me at night. They're all waiting for me, standing in the doorway of our bedroom, and reaching out with hands that leave dark prints on everything they touch. I am tired of fighting them, tired of being afraid. Perhaps it is time to join my family, to end this separation that has caused us all so much pain." Henry was found dead 3 days later in his study, seated at his desk with his journal open before him. His right hand was pressed against the window beside his desk, as if he had been trying to escape from something inside the room, but his face showed the same peaceful expression that had been seen on Catherine's face at the time of her death. The handprint he left on the window was different from those left by his children. It was larger, obviously made by an adult hand, but it was surrounded by smaller prints that matched the hands of Mary, William, Elizabeth, and Thomas, as if the entire family had pressed their hands against the glass together in a final gesture of unity. After Henry's death, the Ashford mansion had stood empty for several years before being sold to distant relatives who had no knowledge of the family's tragic history. The new owners, the Patterson family, had reported strange occurrences from the moment they moved in, particularly handprints appearing on walls, windows, and mirrors throughout the house. The handprints seemed to appear most frequently in the dining room, where the family photograph had been taken, and they were always accompanied by other supernatural phenomena. The Pattersons reported hearing the voices of children calling throughout the house, seeing small figures in white nightgowns moving through the hallways, and finding their belongings rearranged in ways that suggested invisible hands had been moving them. Most disturbing of all,